On May 13th, 1980, a small aircraft would take off from Rio de Janeiro for a survey mission. It was tasked with unraveling the mysteries of the vast jungles between Rio and Sao Paulo. Instead, after a routine call to air traffic control, it would become a mystery itself. It would never be seen again, and weeks of searches by land, sea, and air would fail to uncover any trace of the aircraft. Nearly 45 years later, this forgotten mystery remains unsolved, and the fate of the aircraft's 7 occupants remain unknown. I've spent the past months looking at local newspaper articles documenting the search efforts and witness sightings to try and learn what might have happened to Papa Tango Kilo Hotel Kilo. In the early 1960s, rampant inflation, laws socializing the profits of businesses operating in the country, attempts to redistribute land, and economic reforms created primarily to buy votes from the lower rungs of society had left the Brazilian economy in shambles. These issues, combined with other concerns such as the government's support for socialist countries around the world, had been used to justify a coup in 1964, which would see a military junta installed in Brazil until 1985. In order to distinguish themselves from the previous civilian government, encourage foreign investment, and gain financial aid from the US, the junta declared their support for free markets and opposition to statist economic policy. Austerity measures were used to control inflation and further reassure foreign investors. Subsidies were eliminated and increased taxes were used to help resolve the country's financial difficulties. By 1967, these policies had only produced mixed results, as while the attempts to improve the economy, encourage investment, and control inflation had succeeded, they provided little or no benefit to most of the population. It should be noted that the junta doesn't appear to have really cared about free markets or even opposed statist intervention, as we will see later. This was simply made government policy to win back trust and financial assistance from the US and other foreign investors. Foreign investors weren't the only ones to benefit from the improving economy. VOTEC appears to have been started in 1967 by Claudio Ricardo Holk. Holk was a businessman who had previously been involved in large Brazilian airlines. He appears to have been prompted to start this company due to the rising economy in Brazil. He started with 4 aircraft and 100,000 cruzeiros in starting capital. VOTEC's name was the result of a rather labored acronym. The company's full name in English was Technical and Executive Flights S.A. The company's original roster consisted of a Piper Aztec, Piper Cherokee, and 2 Hughes 300 helicopters. The airline's purpose was to provide air taxi services. It is unclear where the company started, but VOTEC would be highly successful. Within a couple years of its founding, it had expanded its services to Belém and was providing flights into the Amazon, including assisting Petrobras with oil prospecting. Its primary source of income would be from regional flights connecting 7 states and charter flights serving the agricultural, mining, and oil industries. Charter flights serving offshore oil rigs were particularly lucrative. The company would continue to operate in this form until the mid-1970s. At this time, the government decided to intervene in the aviation market with Project CITAR. CITAR, short for Integrated Regional Air Transport System in English, was a program created with the goal of improving air transport in the country. Specifically, the regional airline business had been declining since the 1950s. This had been due to poor infrastructure that couldn't handle larger aircraft. VOTEC was one of 5 airlines to participate in Project CITAR. These airlines were assigned 5 separate regions in Brazil. VOTEC would then start operations as a regional airline in October of 1976. As part of its new operations, it would obtain a number of Embraer 110 Bandeirantes. A secondary goal of Project CITAR was to sell this Brazilian-made aircraft, which was designed for the regional work the government wanted to encourage. Among the aircraft purchased around this time by VOTEC were 15 BN-2 Islanders. The airline's operations at this time were focused in Goiânia, Belém, and San Luis. Various cities and towns in the states of Goiás, Pará, Maranhão, Piauí, Mato Grosso, Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro were served by the airline, as well as the Federal District. By late 1978, the airline operated in 30 cities with 160 flights per week. From what I can gather, the airline's fixed-wing roster at this time consisted of 15 Islanders, at least 7 Embraer 110s, and at least 1 Piper Apache, Piper Cherokee, Piper Navajo, and Mitsubishi MU-2. This fleet would grow significantly when VOTEC acquired 5 DC-3s at auction around this time. The aircraft were modernized and entered passenger service in 1979. The Brazilian economy had been hard hit by the Iran oil shocks, which occurred in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution in January of 1979. Due to the chaos of the revolution and increased tensions between Iran's neighbors, oil exports from Iran were cut off. Oil prices subsequently skyrocketed and caused economic issues in many countries, including Brazil. This was exacerbated by economic mismanagement from the government and major labor strikes occurring during this period. In 1979, VOTEC began studying the possibility of going public. In 1980, the airline owned 57 aircraft and had assets worth $556.2 million cruiseros. VOTEC did not have a perfect safety record. 12 were killed on February 28, 1975, when a Sikorsky S-58 helicopter suffered a tail rotor failure. On June 14, 1979, a VOTEC Islander crashed under unknown circumstances, killing 4 of 6 occupants. The recently purchased DC-3s were also becoming a problem for the airline. Due to the oil shocks, fuel was becoming very expensive, and the DC-3s were removed from regular service to cut costs. They were used on postal runs instead, while VOTEC assigned their Bandeirantes to pick up the slack. The DC-3s would later be disposed of and replaced with Fokker F-27s, which wouldn't arrive until 1982. The airline would suffer another loss on March 20, 1980. A Sikorsky S-76 helicopter was flying 12 oil rig workers from an oil platform 70 kilometers off the coast of Rio de Janeiro back to land for their routine onshore rest period. Shortly after departure from the rig, in plain view of the rig's crew, the helicopter went out of control and crashed into the sea. Another S-76 would crash in Scotland under similar circumstances in 1981. Both incidents were caused by fatigue failures, which had caused a main rotor blade to break off. These incidents appear to have been caused by a design flaw in the S-76, rather than any sort of negligence by the operators. All 14 people on board were killed. The second loss this month would occur 10 days later, on March 30th, when an Islander registered Papa Tango Juliet Sierra Charlie stalled on takeoff in Mato Grosso, killing all 9 on board. On April 3rd, another S-58 would crash, this time without loss of life. Sierra Charlie wouldn't be the only Islander lost this year, and in this case, lost is quite literal. Papa Tango Kilo Hotel Kilo, which we will refer to as Hotel Kilo, was a BN-2A-6 Islander built sometime in 1970 or 1971. It was delivered to Sid Aero of Sweden at an unknown point in 1971, then registered Sierra Echo Foxtrot Tango Bravo. It would then be sold to the Brazilian Red Cross, being delivered on November 26, 1974, and being re-registered as Papa Tango Kilo Hotel Kilo. It was finally sold to VOTEC in 1977. It appears there were no previous incidents involving the aircraft. No photographs of Hotel Kilo exist, as far as I'm aware, but based on other VOTEC aircraft, this is likely what it looked like. The aircraft would have been wearing VOTEC's distinctive white, blue, and yellow livery. The aircraft was most likely in a passenger configuration with a maximum of 10 occupants, including 2 crew. In 1970, the Brazilian Amazon basin was one of the most poorly mapped regions in the world. During that year, things would begin to change. President Emilio Medici would announce the government's intention to increase development in the Amazon, a region which was known to harbor a great many natural resources. To accomplish this, the foreknowledge of the rough and inhospitable Amazon would have to be greatly improved, a very challenging task which would require some out-of-the-box thinking. This was where the government's attempts to cozy up to the United States paid off. At this time, the United States had been fighting the Vietnam War, and as part of the conflict, significant advancements had been made in the field of side-looking airborne radar technology. SLAR was a type of radar that could be installed on aircraft and used to create accurate scans of terrain. These scans could then be stitched together to create a larger map referred to as a mosaic. The system was originally installed on U.S. Army OV-1 Mohawk reconnaissance aircraft and was used to create maps and locate enemy positions in the jungles of Vietnam.
Side-looking airborne radar provides radar visibility in depth at any time of day or night and in fair weather or foul.
At some point, it was realized that this technology also had valuable civilian uses as well. SLAR could be used to map out vast swaths of territory for use in civilian projects at a relatively low cost. This would catch the attention of the Brazilian government, who recognized the value of America's SLAR technology. In a joint effort between NASA and Brazil's National Commission of Space Activity, SLAR flights began around the then under construction Trans-Amazonian Highway Network in 1970. This would become known as Project RADAM, short for Radar Amazon. This program would be an immense success. Originally supposed to cover 1.5 million square kilometers, it was expanded to cover over 4.6 million square kilometers, covering most of northern Brazil by 1974. The project appears to have been organized by the government, but largely performed by the private sector. Soon, representatives from various industries would request further expansion of the program. In 1975, Project RADAM was renamed to Project RADAM Brazil to reflect its greater scope, though it appears as though it was still commonly referred to as Project RADAM. As part of the project, various mineral resources had been discovered. The soil of the Amazon was also studied, as well as the possibility of oil deposits. Not all of this work could be performed from the air. Geologists and other experts would be required to enter the Amazon to collect data and samples as part of Project RADAM. These experts would have to be transported from Brazil's big cities up north to their work sites deep in the Amazon. It appears that this was accomplished by flying them to smaller airfields closer to the Amazon, then possibly flying them via helicopter to their work sites, or possibly traveling by road and foot. VOTEC, with its services between cities like Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Brasilia, and its networks taking passengers to the north of Brazil, made it a solid candidate to carry out the first part of Project RADAM's personnel transport needs. The month of May 1980 was a busy time. Longtime Yugoslavian dictator Josip Broz Tito had died on the 4th. The bloody siege of the Iranian embassy in London, which had started the previous month, was brought to a decisive end by SAS commandos on the 5th. On the 8th, the global eradication of smallpox was announced. Following day, the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in Tampa Bay, Florida, was struck by a ship, causing it to collapse and killing 35 motorists. This was the second fatal accident around the bridge that year, as the US CGC Blackthorn collided with another ship near the bridge in January, killing 23. As for Brazil, the military regime was beginning to weaken at this time. The economic miracle that had come about in the early years of the regime was collapsing, exacerbated by numerous large-scale strikes. Inflation was beginning to run rampant again, the people grew more and more discontent, and the current president, João Figueiredo, would be the last president of the military regime. Days ago, May 13th, 1980, was an insignificant day in a significant month. About the only noteworthy things to occur on that day were the issuing of a patent for a heart defibrillator and an imported oil fee being found unconstitutional in the US. There is, however, a third event not mentioned in any list of notable events occurring on this day. In the late morning of the 13th, Hotel Kilo was sitting on the tarmac at Rio de Janeiro's Santos Dumont Airport. This airport, the smaller of Rio's two major airports, is located 6 kilometers northeast of the famous Christ the Redeemer statue. The aircraft would soon leave Rio for another flight, though this was not one of its usual services. Captain Franklin Bay de Silva would have arrived at the airport earlier that morning. He was 33 years old and had been flying for 10 years, amassing around 5,000 flight hours. During that time, according to his wife, he had been involved in a single accident when his aircraft had some sort of unspecified problem and had made a violent emergency landing at Bauru in the state of São Paulo. He sustained a minor cut to his head in this incident. He had previously been a member of the Brazilian Air Force and had been employed by various airlines. He had been hired by VOTEC 6 months previously. He had returned to Rio from the city of Foz do Iguaçu in the state of Parana the previous day, having been in Iguaçu for the past 15 days. He was not originally scheduled to perform this flight, but one of his colleagues had called in sick and he was assigned to carry out this flight. Captain de Silva would soon be joined by First Officer Walter Ferreira. The 52-year-old father of 5 was a resident of Rio de Janeiro and had been a pilot for over 20 years. He had amassed approximately 10,000 flight hours. He had worked for Varig for 7 years, as well as Paraense Transportes Aéreos for an unknown amount of time. While employed by Paraense, he was involved in a crash landing when his aircraft suffered a landing gear malfunction. Ferreira had been working at VOTEC for 2 years. He was apparently experienced in the Fokker F-27, a valuable skill seeing as though VOTEC was planning to replace its DC-3s with F-27s soon. Ferreira's father had been opposed to his choice to become a pilot, and his wife had complained that he spent little time at home. It appears that he had finally gotten some time to spend with his family prior to the 13th. He had been performing some work on his house when he received the call to come to the airport. The 2 pilots and Hotel Kilo had been given an unusual task. They would have been met at the airport by 5 women. Professors Emilia Moreira and Leda Neves were employed by the Universidade Federal Fluminense, or UFF. Moreira held a degree in geography and a postgraduate degree in geochemistry. She had previously taken a specialization course in France. Leda Neves was employed by the UFF's Department of Geography and presumably had similar qualifications to Moreira. Accompanying the professors were geographers Alcione Quirco and Eliana Franco. The 5th passenger was Marissa Machado, who worked in the field of photoanalysis. Whether due to errors by the newspapers or poor translation, geography and geology are used interchangeably, creating some confusion as to the exact qualifications and roles of the team members. Eliana Franco was apparently the team leader and had been a member of 19 previous missions of a similar nature. Alcione Quirco was employed as a geologist for the previous 2.5 years. He had previously worked as a primary school teacher. This was the first time she would be engaging in air work during her employment by Project Redan. Her father, Jose Quirico, would be highly active during the later search efforts, partially criticizing VOTEC for reasons that will soon become clear. Her brother was a major in the Brazilian Air Force and would be involved in the early stages of the search. Marissa Machado, married and a mother of 3, was an expert in photoanalysis. She would soon celebrate her 35th birthday. In preparation for the flight, she had brought an apple with her, apparently to stave off motion sickness. This was the only food brought by anyone on board the airplane. Her husband, Carlos, would also be active in the search. These women were part of Project Ray Dam, which by this point had been expanded beyond the Amazon. At some point prior to the 13th, a series of SLAR missions had been performed in the states of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Espírito Santo. From what I can gather, the women were tasked with overflying areas in these states to verify the accuracy of the previous SLAR missions by flying over the examined area and comparing it to the mosaics. They may have also been tasked with performing soil surveys. Overall, this team was considered to be highly experienced. The original plan would be for the team to fly from Rio to Campinas on the 13th, then Pocos de Caldas on the 14th, Ribeirão Preto on the 15th, and return to Pocos de Caldas on the 16th. They would then fly to Belo Horizonte on the 17th, then Vitoria on the 18th. The aircraft would spend the 19th flying around the Vitoria area and returning there before flying back to Rio on the 20th. The 21st and 22nd would be spent performing additional work in the Rio area. The plan for the 13th appears to have been to overfly the region between the cities of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. The focus appears to have been on the Serra do Mar region, a mountain range covered in dense jungle with the Paraíba Valley to the north and the sea to the south. The aircraft was expected to fly to Viracopos Airport in the city of Campinas, north of Sao Paulo, or to return to Rio. The crew had an itinerary set out for the mission, but were given the authority to change it depending on time, convenience, and weather. A report from May 22nd stated that the crew would not have been able to contract the tower, presumably air traffic control. Why this was the case is not stated. More specifically, the route was described in the Folha de Sao Paulo as follows. On the first day, they would travel 920 kilometers, flying over the Marambaia Peak, Serra do Mar, Paraty, Ponta do Carioca, from where they would return to see the Serra do Mar escarpment again, Itambira River, Caraguatatuba Bay, Ponta do Boi, the foot of Morro do Cedro Santos, Light Dam, Borabira Dam, Serra do Mar, Cachoeira do Franca Dam, Itapetitininga River, Japi Mountain Range, and Campinas. With a bit of research, I was able to identify most of these locations. Marambaia is a peninsula around 45 nautical miles or 83 kilometers from Santos Dumont. The Serra do Mar is a mountain range crossing the states of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo that closely follows the coast. Hotel Kilo's flight path would spend much of its time above this range. Paraty is a coastal town 88 nautical miles or 153 kilometers from Santos Dumont. Ponta do Carioca is a bit of a mystery. No terrain feature with that name is present in the region. The closest I could find was the Morro de Carioca, a hill next to the sea in the town of Angra dos Reis, 25 nautical miles northeast of Paraty. The aircraft would have passed Angra dos Reis earlier in the flight, but to go to Angra dos Reis after passing Paraty doesn't make much sense, so I'm inclined to say that this is not the feature being referred to. The next feature is the Rio Itambira. No river of that name exists in this region, but there is a Rio Itamambuca that is located along the approximate flight path of the aircraft near the borders of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Next, they would pass the Caraguatatuba Bay, then the Ponta do Boi on the island of Ilha Bela off the coast of Sao Paulo. The Morro do Cedro Santos is another mystery. This is presumably a mountain or hill between Ilha Bela and the city of Sao Paulo. The Light Dam, or Represa de Light, may be a small reservoir just south of Sao Paulo. Similarly, the Borabira Dam may refer to the Represa de Guaraparanga, a reservoir on the outskirts of Sao Paulo. Cachoeira de Franco and Rio Ipetetininga are water features west of Sao Paulo. Lastly, the Serra do Japi is a small mountain range just north of Sao Paulo. The aircraft would then land at Viracopos. In addition to the original planned route, which we will call Route 1, the Jornal de Brazil would provide further detail on two other possible flight paths. After flying to Paraty, the aircraft would fly south to the Pedra do Sono. No feature of this name exists south of Paraty, but there is a Praia do Sono 8.5 nautical miles or 16 kilometers south of Paraty. This is where the three flight paths appear to diverge. The first alternate route, which we will call Route 2, appears to have followed the same path as Route 1 until reaching the Paraty area. Instead of continuing west towards Sao Paulo, the aircraft would return to Angra, fly over the Itaquaruca area, and then pass over an area known as Restinga. There are numerous places with that name in the region, but the two most likely candidates are the previously mentioned Restinga de Marambaia or the coastal neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro. From there, the aircraft would presumably land at Santos Dumont. The second alternate route, which we will call Route 3, also diverges at Paraty. This route heads north towards the city of Itatiaia, passing over the Fanil Dam and its reservoir, then enters the tall mountainous territory of the Itatiaia National Park. The aircraft would then fly towards Sao Paulo before turning around, flying back towards Itatiaia following the Paraiba Valley, then flying over the Serra do Mar and the town of Itaguai before returning to Rio. Given the nature of the work, the aircraft would spend most of its time over land despite being close to the coast. According to the Jornal de Brazil, the aircraft would be traveling in a zigzag pattern along the coast, never straying too close to the sea. The aircraft may not have been flying directly between each point on the flight path, making the exact flight path flown on each day somewhat unclear. After meeting at the airport, all seven would board Hotel Kilo and prepare to depart on their mission. It should be noted that it was later claimed that the mission the aircraft was tasked with was secret. It evidently wasn't that secret, as many of the details of the mission were released to the media shortly after the accident, but this supposed secrecy may have had some effect on the events to come. It is not known what altitude the aircraft was expected to fly at. It's possible that this would have changed as the aircraft traversed its chosen route. Since the islander is not pressurized, the aircraft would have remained below 10,000 feet. It is also not known what weather conditions were like at the time. Given that the survey work would have likely required clear weather conditions to see the terrain, and no mention of the weather was made in any of the newspaper reporting, it seems likely that weather and visibility was fine at the time of the accident. Hotel Kilo would leave Santos Dumont Airport at 12:25 p.m. The aircraft then traveled west along the coast. At 12:51, Hotel Kilo made contact with ATC. The exact contents of this message are not given, but the crew had apparently informed the controllers that they were over Ponta Grossa de Marambaia. They stated that they would leave instrument flight rules, or IFR, and continue under visual flight rules, or VFR, until reaching Angra dos Reis. They reported nothing out of the ordinary. The message itself was normal, though the method by which it was transmitted was noteworthy. The crew did not communicate directly with the controllers at Rio. Instead, a Lockheed Electra airliner belonging to Varig, which happened to be in the area, was contacted by the crew of Hotel Kilo. This aircraft was able to communicate with the controllers and relayed the message. It was apparently expected that the aircraft would be unable to communicate with controllers without assistance. It is not explained why this was the case, though this detail is highly relevant to the events that would occur later that day. The crew would have presumably contacted, or at least tried to contact ATC once they reached Angra dos Reis. Assuming they flew direct to Angra, this would be about 19 nautical miles or 35 kilometers. At a speed of 120 knots, the typical cruising speed for an islander, it would take a bit under 10 minutes to reach Angra. Given this aircraft's mission, however, it may not have headed straight there, instead traveling over the Serra do Mar or Serra das Araras as part of its survey work, though what the goals of the aircraft were at the stage of the flight were unclear. With the aircraft under VFR, controllers no longer needed to frequently communicate with Hotel Kilo. Perhaps for this reason, no one in Rio took note of the failure of Hotel Kilo to contact them at Angra, or anywhere else. After a bit of a lull on the 13th, May continued to be a chaotic month. On the 16th, the Prime Minister of Japan was impeached. May 18th may have been the most active day of the month, as on that day, Mount St. Helens would erupt in Washington, China would successfully test its first ICBM, and ongoing unrest in North Korea would escalate into a series of protests that would be put down by the country's military government, killing hundreds. On the 20th, the Canadian province of Quebec would reject a referendum calling for the province's independence. On the same day, a home for the elderly in Jamaica would burn down in an unsolved case of arson, killing 157. Today, the long-awaited sequel to Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, would be released in theaters. In the following June, Pope John Paul II was expected to visit Brazil, a major event in the predominantly Catholic country, and one that was greatly anticipated. Meanwhile, the Folha de São Paulo, a newspaper from the city of the same name, was reporting the news for May 21st. The government's recent decision to cut imports to compensate for oil price increases, the previously mentioned arson in Jamaica, the release of future Brazilian President Luiz da Silva, better known as Lula, and the University of São Paulo demanding more funding were among the front-page stories being reported on that day. Buried deep within the paper, on page 14, under stories about the local zoo's efforts to control the birth rates of their lions, and the mayor announcing a new construction project in the Campo Limpo district, a rather odd story was told. At around 7:30 p.m. Monday night, several people in the towns of Jambero, Redenção, and Natividade da Serra reported hearing a loud explosion after hearing an aircraft pass overhead. A farmer from Jambero claimed to have seen a small aircraft flying overhead before exploding. What made the situation stranger was that authorities had no knowledge of a missing aircraft in the region, leaving the situation as a bit of a mystery. Being published on the 21st, this story was likely written and investigated on the 20th. On this day, VOTEC had apparently been experiencing some confusion of its own. By the 19th, Hotel Kilo should have been at Vitoria, and it would have returned to Rio on the 20th. Captain da Silva was expected to contact VOTEC's headquarters in Rio on Sunday, May 18th. Nothing had been heard from him or any of the occupants. Perhaps in a case of poor translation quality, the Folha de São Paulo from May 30th claims that the disappearance was reported 5 hours after it had occurred. This doesn't make much sense, and doesn't match with the large amount of available evidence suggesting that it took around a week for them to notice that the aircraft was missing. More likely, what it means is that it took 5 hours for VOTEC to report the aircraft missing on the 20th. This was consequential as it was then too late to begin searches, which could only be started the next day. 20th, VOTEC contacted Salvero. This is the branch of the Brazilian Air Force responsible for search and rescue work. The fact that it took a week to notice the absence of Hotel Kilo would cause considerable controversy, and for good reason. Unfortunately, no explanation was provided for this lapse. The multiple possible routes, lack of reliable communication, and the possibility of landing at either Viracopos or Rio likely led to some confusion. For example, someone at Viracopos waiting for Hotel Kilo may have assumed that the aircraft had returned to Rio, while someone at Rio may have assumed the aircraft continued on to Viracopos. Where things get particularly confusing is how it took so long to notice the absence of Hotel Kilo. The crew would have needed to spend the night somewhere on the ground at each of their stops. Presumably, arrangements would have been made beforehand. Despite this, VOTEC did not report the aircraft missing for several days. The only reason given by VOTEC that was stated in the newspapers was that the mission was secret. It should be noted that VOTEC apparently gave other reasons, but these were not repeated in the newspapers. Regardless, the delay likely affected the end result of the search. Search and rescue teams were mobilized on the 20th, based out of Santa Cruz Air Base, located just west of Rio near Marambaya and Angra dos Reis. Salvero's focus on this day was along Route 1, searching along the coast near the towns of Mangaratiba, Angra, Parati, Ilhabela, and the Sao Paulo area. Additional searches were performed in the area where the explosion was heard on the 19th. At this stage, there appears to have been little news reporting. Of the two newspapers I referenced, only the Jornal do Brasil reported on this story this day, and even then, the story was only a few short paragraphs. This would change in the following days and would have negative consequences on the search. 9:30 p.m., a number of amateur radio operators in Belo Horizonte would report hearing the following message. Many of the listeners believed this message was a hoax, though one man, a former banker with nearly 20 years of experience as an amateur radio operator, was not convinced. He speculated that the crew might be using the aircraft's radio to try and receive help. He also commented that whoever was sending the message knew little about amateur radio, quote, since he would have to know his location first, end quote. Perhaps this is a case of poor translation quality, but I'm not sure what he meant by this. There are two details that should be noted with this message. First, the registration given in the message is incorrect. Instead of giving the correct registration of Papa Tango Kilo Hotel Kilo, the registration is instead quoted as Papa Tango Hotel Kilo Hotel. Given that the voice on the radio came from a man, if this message was real, it would have been sent by one of the pilots. It is highly unlikely that an experienced pilot would forget the registration of an aircraft, especially when it was painted on the side of said aircraft. This would be rock-solid evidence proving this message is a hoax, but the Jornal do Brasil, the newspaper which quoted this message, had made similar errors in later coverage. For example, on June 1st, it would refer to Hotel Kilo as Papa Tango Kilo Quebec Kilo. On June 12th, they would repeat this mistake again, referring to Hotel Kilo as Papa Tango Hotel Kilo Hotel. The Folha de Sao Paulo did not quote this message, and thus I cannot confirm whether this was correctly quoted or an error made by the Jornal do Brasil. The second detail worth noting is the location of Araras. This name creates a bit of confusion. There are two locations in the region that bear the name of Araras. The first is the Serra das Araras, a mountain range that forms part of the Serra do Mar in Rio de Janeiro, located about 18 kilometers north of Marambaya. The second is Araras, a town in Sao Paulo, located 74 kilometers north of Campinas. I wasn't the only one initially confused by this, as Salvero was also unsure of which region was being referred to. Between the two, the Serra das Araras seems more likely. The town of Araras is surrounded by farms with only small patches of forest interspersed. In addition to this, the town is far away from the likely flight path, and the aircraft likely never made it this far. In contrast, the Serra das Araras was located nearby to the last known position in an area that, given the aircraft's mission, may have been one of the regions it was planned to overfly. Regardless, both areas were searched without success. Searches would continue in the morning of the 22nd. Salvero released a statement to the press saying that if the aircraft went down in the Serra do Mar, it would be difficult to locate the wreck. More specifically, they believed that it would only be possible to find the wreck if it had created a clearing due to the destruction of trees as it had crashed. They also stated that the aircraft would be difficult to locate if it had gone down in the sea, which had a depth of around 30 meters in the area being searched. Though not stated, the quantity of resources assigned to this search appear to have been rather small. Only 2 helicopters belonging to Salvero and a single VOTEC aircraft were involved in the search on this day, alongside an unknown number of ground searchers. As will be detailed in later reporting, the dense jungles of the Serra do Mar are difficult and dangerous to traverse. These ground searchers appear to have been following up witness reports rather than scouring the jungles. Late in the day, the emergency radio service would receive a report from an amateur radio operator in the city of Taubaté, located along Route 3. This report was quickly dismissed, though the reasons are somewhat murky. This report was later labeled as a hoax. At some point during the day, a seaplane and helicopter were sent to search the Serra das Araras. Authorities appear to have been skeptical of the previous day's SOS message, pointing out that the frequency used by ATC and the amateur radio operators are different. There was also mention of an air show having occurred somewhere in the region involving paratroopers, possibly causing some confusion. No more details are given in this regard. On June 4th, a director of the Brazilian Radio Amateurs League would write a letter criticizing the media for its negative coverage of the efforts of amateur radio operators. Search efforts were hampered by dense fog on the 23rd, meaning that no air searches could be carried out. As of this day, the total number of aircraft made available for the search consisted of 3 helicopters, 2 Grumman Albatross float planes, and a single Lockheed C-130. The C-130 would only be mobilized if the occupants of Hotel Kilo were found. Salvero officials informed the press that search efforts were made difficult by the terrain, and that observers needed to pay close attention to see any strange movements coming from the ground below. While the air searches were paused for the day, ground searches were still able to continue. The region around Cunha was searched as well as Itinhandu. A pair of geographers from UFF had been investigating leads in the Cunha area. In Cunha, 2 men claimed to have seen a twin-engine aircraft flying overhead on the 13th. The aircraft had some sort of engine issue and was emitting smoke. At some point, the aircraft began flying in circles. At one point, the aircraft even entered a spiral dive of some sort before apparently recovering. The plane then flew away in the direction of Itatiaia. These men also explained that Brazilian Air Force aircraft would regularly fly over the area, creating sonic booms. They stated that the aircraft they saw was not one of these aircraft. The 2 geographers would follow the trail to Campos de Cunha, where the residents appear to have corroborated the sightings from Cunha. They would follow the trail towards Cruzeiro, but we will pick up with them later. In Itinhandu, a strange bright spot was seen on the Pico dos Marins, a 7,800-foot tall mountain located 34 kilometers southwest of the town. This bright spot was first seen on the 21st or 22nd, but it was only now that the sighting was being investigated. 4 teams of local police officers were assigned to investigate this sighting. They would spend the day traveling from Itinhandu to the foot of the mountain. It was noted that no one in the region had actually heard any aircraft or explosions on the 13th. The fog from Friday would dissipate on Saturday. Indeed, the weather had cleared enough that the usually cloud-covered Pico dos Marins was completely clear. The bright spot was now clearly seen from Itinhandu between 11 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. It was now more clearly described. It appeared as though someone was using a mirror or a piece of shiny metal to reflect sunlight and create some sort of signal. A helicopter would search the area between 1:30 and 3 p.m. Further searches would be performed by the policemen, accompanied by reporters and local guides. They were not equipped with radios, so the only way to know if they found anything was to watch for any smoke signals made by them, or else to wait for them to make their way back to civilization. In the early afternoon, a man from Itinhandu would come forward saying he had heard explosions coming from the Pico dos Marins. Searches were also performed in the area of Pico das Comera, also based on reports coming from Itinhandu. The source of the light signals seen from Itinhandu was found on this day, or more accurately, it was actually determined the previous day and was only reported by the newspapers on Sunday. The helicopter that searched the mountain on Saturday afternoon had found an old weather vane that was reflecting sunlight as it spun around. Residents of Itinhandu were skeptical of this report, but at noon on Sunday, one of the police teams would return to Itinhandu and confirm the presence of a weather vane at the location where the supposed signals were coming from. Itinhandu was an obscure, underdeveloped town where tallest building was the local church. A single-color television in the town square provided news to the citizens, and men on horseback were a regular sight in the streets. According to its mayor, it had never been in the national headlines at any point in its history until the disappearance of Hotel Kilo. As a result of this, the residents appear to have been overexcited by the attention the town received, making numerous dubious reports regarding any strange thing they saw. Nearly everyone in the town claimed to have heard the aircraft, but none could agree on the date. Some said the 12th, some said the 13th, and some even said the 20th, a week after Hotel Kilo had disappeared. Elsewhere in Minas Gerais, another lead was being followed up. A farmer living between the towns of Passavinte and Santa Rita de Jacutinga had reported seeing an aircraft go down in flames. Searches were made in the area, but nothing was found. The farmer indicated that he had planned to investigate it himself, but quickly gave up due to the dense forests. Yet more dubious claims were made in Campinas, where supposed wreckage was seen near Viracopos Airport. To end the day, the residents of Itanhandu reported finding the wreck of the plane west of the town. Upon investigation by a group of residents, the wreck turned out to be an old plastic bag stuck in a tree. Searchers would decide to start the search from scratch the following day, presumably to the considerable displeasure of Itanhandu. One useful piece of information came from this wild goose chase. The conditions faced by the police search parties in the jungles are described in the papers. These policemen from Itanhandu were only equipped with rifles, machetes, knives, and tents. The only food they had with them were sandwiches they had purchased back in Itanhandu. They lacked basic equipment like ropes. Of note is the temperature, which could drop close to zero during the night. It was so cold, in fact, that the policemen did not use their tents, preferring instead to stay close to their fire. The search would continue as well as the busy May. In the United States, the ongoing Republican primaries would come to an end as George H.W. Bush, the final remaining opponent of Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination, would concede. Reagan would later select Bush as his running mate, and the two men would go on to defeat incumbent President Jimmy Carter in November. Back in Brazil, searchers were getting back on track after the previous day's distractions. Searches were made in the area of Lidice, in the Serra das Araras, by a team of Salvero and Radam personnel. Two other teams that included members of the UFF would search the initial flight path, though where exactly they were searching is not stated. Searchers reviewed their plans and possible routes flown by Hotel Kilo. They ruled out the possibility of the aircraft going down at sea. It was reported in the Jornal de Brazil that the aircraft had an endurance of 7 hours, though it is unclear if the aircraft actually left with 7 hours of fuel on board, or if this was just the maximum amount of fuel the aircraft could be filled with. There is no information regarding what occurred on the 27th. During the 28th, search aircraft would fly a total of 1,200 square miles. This was mainly in the Serra das Araras, performed primarily by Salvero, though VOTEC aircraft would also assist. Hogg had returned to the region, but was not severe enough to stop air searches. There were searches performed in other areas. A helicopter was dispatched from São José dos Campos to Cruzeiro, where it would perform searches. Of particular interest to this helicopter was the railway tunnel between Cruzeiro and Itanhandu, as well as the towns of Passa Quatro and Capela do Jacu. No information is given on why this area was searched. In addition to this, mountains near Rio de Janeiro were also searched as well. Personnel from Project Radam were also performing survey work to assist with the search. At this stage, there appears to have been serious concern that the search would not be successful. A spokesman for Salvero addressed these concerns and stated that search efforts would not end until, quote, specific possibilities end, end quote. Regardless, there was still some optimism at this stage, with the rector and director of the Geoscience Institute at UFF both stating that they believed the occupants were still alive and called for intensified search efforts. The Jornal de Brazil would mention that, according to Salvero's archives, there were 6 aircraft that had gone missing in the region since 1967, carrying a total of 14 people. By this point in the search, A total of 10,000 square miles have been covered over 150 flight hours, using 38,000 liters of fuel. Searches would continue in the same areas as the 28th. Salvero would criticize VOTEC for its delay in reporting the disappearance. Relatives of the missing geographers would also criticize VOTEC, and optimism regarding a positive outcome appears to have been fading. There was little reporting on the events that occurred on Friday the 30th. Late in the day, a police station in Lavrinhas would report a tip regarding the aircraft, but it was now too late in the day to investigate. The tip from Lavrinhas would be investigated the following day. Police had reported that a farmer had found an aircraft's wing on his farm, located 50 kilometers from the town. Aerial searches would be performed in Cruzeiro, Serra de Piquete, Itajuba, and Santa Rita do Sapucaí, all located to the west or northwest of Lavrinhas. The specific report made by the farmer stated that he had seen a colorful plane fly over a hill before hearing an explosion. Loud noises similar to explosions were apparently very uncommon, as the terrain in the region muffled sounds such as gunshots from hunters. It was believed that the vegetation in the area was so dense that aircraft would be unable to adequately search it. An expedition was sent out to investigate the area indicated by the farmer. There are two contradictions in this farmer's claim. First, the aircraft sighting is said to have occurred on the 20th, long after Hotel Kilo went down. Secondly, the claim of a wing being found doesn't seem to have been adequately explained. If the aircraft had lost a wing, it would have gone out of control and immediately crashed. Given the low altitude the aircraft would have been flying at, the wreck would have hit the ground a relatively short distance from the wing, not fly out of sight over a mountain before crashing. Elsewhere, searches along the coast would be performed, checking the areas of Ubatuba, Ilhabela, and Bertioga. Inland, Uratingueta, Cruzeiro, and Lorena were also searched. As the calendar rolled into June, international news would distract from the ongoing events in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Without any clues being found by searchers, the interest of the media would begin to fade, as would hope for a positive outcome. Further attention would be drawn away from Hotel Kilo when, on the morning of June 1st, an air taxi pilot in Mato Grosso would attempt to deliberately fly his aircraft into a hotel where his wife worked. He would miss, colliding with a nearby office, killing all 5 on board the aircraft and multiple people on the ground. A Salvero spokesman would criticize local politicians and police services for their attempts to call attention to their towns and cities, wasting resources. This was undoubtedly aimed at towns like Itanhandu. There would be some good news, as it was also announced that a special device was being brought in to assist with the search. The name of the device is not given, though it was described as being able to detect metals. To me, this sounds like a magnetic anomaly detector. It was expected that this device would arrive on this day and would be used in subsequent searches. On this day, the Folha de Sao Paulo would provide additional information on the previous day's searches. At an unknown date, a woodsman came forward claiming that he had seen an aircraft in distress fly over him towards a mountain peak called the Focinho de Cao. He then heard an explosion. Aerial and ground searches were performed in this area, but nothing was found. Searches were ended at 1 p.m. on the 31st. More information was also provided on the previous claims of a wing being found near Lavrinhas. This had been initially reported by the town's police chief, but he would later claim that these had only been rumors that he had heard. Returning to the 2 geographers who had been following leads in Cunha, they would be the ones who found the woodsman while in Cruzeiro and reported his story to the authorities. The search prompted by the woodsman's story would give another insight into the conditions found in the region's jungles. According to the Folha de Sao Paulo, the two geographers from UFF had brought with them multiple anti-venom serums for snakes in the region, as well as first aid kits and blood plasma in preparation for entering the jungles if the aircraft was found. June 3rd was nothing less than complete chaos in the United States. The ongoing Democratic primaries would come to a climactic conclusion as Jimmy Carter barely fended off Ted Kennedy to win the contest. Also in the political realm, Representative Charles Diggs would resign from office due to charges of fraud. Grand Island, Nebraska, would be hit by 7 tornadoes, destroying hundreds of buildings. This was not enough chaos, apparently, as a computer malfunction would briefly convince the U.S. Air Force and North American Aerospace Defense Command that the Soviets had launched ICBMs at the United States. To close the day, a bomb went off near the Statue of Liberty. Back in Brazil, the coverage of the search in the media would begin to wind down from this point on. The only news for today was that searches were continuing in areas that had already been covered. The Salvero lieutenant in charge of the search clarified previous claims that his team had found 2 of the 7 aircraft that had went missing between Rio and Sao Paulo. He also mentioned a specific aircraft registered Papa Tango India November Yankee that had previously gone missing. This aircraft was apparently, quote, not located now, but in mid-December, end quote, possibly referring to the time of year in which it was discovered. 7 radam technicians would be sent to the Cunha area to recruit locals for additional search efforts. Specifically, they were looking to hire men to perform searches between Cunha and Paraty. The directors of VOTEC, representatives from Project Radam, and leaders of Salvero's search efforts would meet to review search plans. Searches would occur to the north of São Lourenço and southeast of São José dos Campos. It's not clear where São Lourenço is, either referring to a town north of Itanhandu or a mountain range west of the city of Sao Paulo. As for searches southeast of São José dos Campos, this lines up with the Jambero area. After a final day of searching, Salvero decided to end search efforts. The final locations they checked were around Monte Verde, Piracaya, and Agua. They announced that they would only restart searches if some credible evidence was produced. Searches led by radam technicians would continue. Radam officials would criticize VOTEC's justification for the delay in reporting the search, which they claimed took 5 days after the plane went missing. They stated that the mission was not so secret that it should have taken that long to alert authorities. On this day, it was claimed that the last contact with Hotel Kilo was made over the Serra de Mantiqueira on the borders of Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro. Nowhere else is this location provided, as all other reports indicate that the final contact occurred near the Ponta Grossa de Murumbaia. In the U.S., another congressman would find himself in hot water, as Representative Charles Wilson would be censured for his involvement in financial misconduct. Meanwhile, the president of United Airlines would be injured by a bomb, later determined to have been sent by Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. Back in Brazil, a plume of smoke was seen in the forest around Praia Dura near Ubatuba. A helicopter, possibly belonging to VOTEC, flew over the area. No sign of the aircraft was seen, but this was still considered a lead worth pursuing. The Sao Paulo Fire Department was notified so they could be prepared to assist in the investigation of this lead. It was not determined if the fire department in Jacarai had been notified. This was noted by the papers, as this fire department was assigned to assist with any recovery efforts. The lack of communication with Jacarai may have indicated a lack of confidence in this lead. Morning, local police had arrived at Praia Dura to prepare for searches. A highway patrolman stated that if the aircraft was in the region, it would be very difficult to locate. This patrolman had been involved in another search effort which occurred sometime the previous week. There were rumors that an aircraft had been seen at an unknown time losing altitude near Peruba. I was unable to figure out where Peruba was, but it is apparently 45 kilometers from Ubatuba. As part of continuing search efforts, VOTEC had received some sort of advanced infrared device. This device, donated by AGA Thermovision of Sao Paulo, was able to detect, quote, metallic bodies that emit heat. It was unclear if this was the same metal detecting device that was mentioned previously. This device would be installed aboard a VOTEC Sikorsky helicopter, which would perform a search around the expected flight path. The helicopter ended its search at Angra dos Reis, having found nothing. It was still believed that this technology would help with the search. Fatal air crashes would occur in Nebraska and Tajikistan. Another U.S. politician would find himself in hot water, as Bill Clayton, Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, would be caught accepting a bribe by the FBI. Not to be outdone, Japanese Prime Minister Masayoshi Ohira, who had been forced to call an election after losing a vote of no confidence less than a month previously, would cause an even greater disruption by dying partway through his re-election campaign. Turning to Brazil, the smoke near Praia Dura would be investigated by local police. Upon reaching the site, they would discover that it was not a plane crash, but rather the result of a landslide. The modified VOTEC helicopter would continue its efforts, sweeping the area between Angra and Cruzeiro before checking Ilhabela and Ubatuba and returning to Angra. Yet another politician in the U.S. was in hot water after being caught accepting a bribe. Representative John Jenrette Jr. was indicted on charges of bribery as part of an FBI sting operation. In Brazil, a month had now passed since the disappearance of Hotel Kilo. The modified VOTEC helicopter would continue searching, but the suspension of all remaining search efforts was clearly on the horizon. The focus of the families and other interested parties was shifting towards efforts to keep the search going. The mother of Amelia Moreira wrote a letter to President Figueiredo requesting the involvement of the Brazilian army for additional ground searches. By this point, any hope of finding the occupants alive appears to have faded. Carlos Machado would tell papers, quote, I don't want to know about public acts or who is to blame. What I want to know is the fate of my wife. And they were not the only ones to have given up. Salvero submitted a final report on its search to the Ministry of Aeronautics. A total of 85,500 square miles were covered across nearly 319 flight hours. 60 men had participated in the search. At least one Salvero aircraft had multiple failures in flight while searching, endangering the crew. This report was filed as, quote, missions accomplished but not resolved, end quote, which appears to be a fancy way of saying that they had found nothing despite an extensive search. In this region of Brazil, only one other incident was filed under this category. This was a Cessna 172, which went missing between Linares and Vitoria in November of 1976. At this stage, more regarding the flight was revealed by a study created by geologists from the UFF and University of Sao Paulo. The visibility on May 13th was 1/3, and cumulonimbus clouds were present in the area. A possible flight path was given. After passing over Angra, the aircraft would fly over the Serra de Bocaina to Cunha, then fly towards Cruzeiro and the Pico de Gomera. Where it would go after this point is not said. The belief that the aircraft had not gone down in the sea was reiterated, with Salvero officials saying that the wreckage would have already been found. They also pointed out that two of the aircraft's occupants had previously taken a sea survival course, though which occupants are not stated. On this day, Chinese scientist Peng Xiaomu went missing while looking for water for his team while performing research in western China. His remains have never been located. One final effort would be made to locate Hotel Kilo. The Ministry of Mines and Energy, which was responsible for Project Radam, would authorize a final search. A Radam team would be given a side-scan sonar system from the Navy and search underwater between Marambaya and Angra. This was in contradiction to the previous claims made a few days before that the aircraft was unlikely to have gone down at the sea. It is possible at this point the searchers may have simply decided to try and check every remaining possibility. I was unable to find any update on these searches or any other information regarding the incident in the papers. This was, in fact, the final mention of Papa Tango Kilo Hotel Kilo that I was able to find. The lack of clues, upcoming arrival of the Pope on the 30th, and other news had pushed Hotel Kilo's unsolved disappearance out of the papers. Hotel Kilo and its 7 occupants would never be found, and it appears to have been forgotten by most in the years since. One of the things hindering my attempts to look into this case is the lack of a publicly available final report. As previously mentioned, Salvero made a report detailing their search efforts, but I was unable to locate this report. It is also unclear if SNIPA, the organization responsible for investigating aviation accidents in Brazil, had created a report on this specific accident. Some reports from this period are available, such as the report on the crash of the VOTEC helicopter in March of 1980. In order to further analyze this case, I had to think a bit outside the box. The Jornal do Brasil, on May 29th, makes a passing mention of 6 aircraft disappearing in the states of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo between 1967 and 1980. A total of 14 people were on board these aircraft. The Jornal doesn't say anything beyond this. Fortunately, the Folha de Sao Paulo would provide additional information. It would provide the same number of aircraft and occupants, but would provide 2 very important additional details, this being registrations and dates. This would allow me to further investigate. On August 13, 1967, an unknown aircraft with 2 on board went missing somewhere in Brazil, presumably either in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo. I looked through the Folha de Sao Paulo and Jornal do Brasil and did some searching on the internet, but there was nothing more I could find. On July 8, 1969, Armindo Brochado was making a refueling stop at Resende while flying between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Brochado owned a chain of men's clothing stores and frequently traveled in his Cessna of unknown type on business trips through the region. While refueling, he was informed of bad weather and was advised not to continue. He ignored this advice and left for Rio. He would not arrive, and searches would be carried out for 6 months without finding anything. Nearly 9 years later, on March 31st, 1978, the remains of Armindo Brochado and his aircraft would be found. It is not stated where or under what circumstances this occurred, though context clues suggest this was in the mountains west of Itaguai, a few kilometers west of Rio de Janeiro. An interesting detail is that the wreck site was close enough to civilization to allow local police to reach the wreck, recover the now skeletal remains of Brochado, and bring them back to Itaguai for identification within 24 hours of the discovery. On January 19, 1975, a Cessna 182 with 4 people on board departed a town called São Matias for Rio de Janeiro at 5 p.m. It was forced to make an emergency landing at somewhere called Venda Velha due to bad weather. The aircraft would leave to continue its trip and was never seen again. By the 24th, searches were ongoing with no trace of the aircraft being found at the point. Any further analysis of this case is complicated by the lack of information regarding the actual location of São Matias and Venda Velha. São Matias appears to be a relatively common name for towns in Brazil, and the only place named Venda Velha that I could locate in the region was a small neighborhood well within Rio de Janeiro's urban area that has no airport, no space for an airport, and seems entirely implausible as the location being referred to. On January 19, 1977, not 1, but 2 aircraft would go missing in the Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo region. These were Papa Tango November Golf Quebec, an Embraer 710 with 3 people on board, and Papa Tango Charlie Bravo Hotel, an unknown aircraft with only the pilot on board. I was unable to find any additional information on these two disappearances. The timing may suggest that these aircraft went missing as a result of a mid-air collision, but without any more information, it's hard to say anything more about these cases. On January 17, 1978, an Embraer 710 took off from Ilhabela for Campo Marte Airport in the city of Sao Paulo. The pilot was Marcio Perez, an industrialist, as well as his two passengers. The aircraft would not arrive. Within hours, it was reported missing and searches were initiated. The focus was on the mountainous coastal regions of Sao Paulo, where the aircraft would have been flying. Official searches would be called off at an unknown date, though private searches funded by the families would be performed for a short time afterward. Months after the disappearance, in the late morning of September 24th of the same year, 3 farmers would enter the jungle near Pico de Esplanada. They were looking for hearts of palm and needed to go further into the jungle than usual to find some. After crossing 2 hills, they would find what they were looking for. While climbing up a tree, one of the men would see an aircraft wreck nearby. They would investigate and went to call the police upon finding human remains. The wreck of the Embraer 710 was located on Pico Esplanada, 2.5 kilometers from a village. Within 24 hours, a team consisting of local policemen, Brazilian Air Force members, possibly from Salvador, and relatives of the aircraft's occupants would reach the site. The aircraft's wreckage was almost destroyed, and it's not clear if any cause was ever found. 2 other aircraft were mentioned by newspapers in the weeks following Hotel Kilo's disappearance. On June 6th, the Folha de Sao Paulo would briefly mention another missing aircraft registered Papa Tango India November Yankee, which had gone missing in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo at some unknown point in the past. This aircraft was found and recovered sometime in December, but what year it went down or was recovered was not stated. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any information on this aircraft. Searching the ASN Wikibase produced no results for any kind of aircraft bearing this registration. On June 13th, the Jornal do Brasil would mention another missing aircraft. This was a Cessna 172 with an unknown registration that went missing during a flight between Linhares and Vitória in the state of Espírito Santo in November of 1976. I was unable to find anything more on the case. This was apparently the only other case from the southwestern region that was filed by Salvador as missions accomplished but not resolved. While searching through ASN's list of aircraft accidents in Brazil between 1967 and 1980, it becomes clear that aircraft frequently go missing in Brazil. I lost count of the number of missing aircraft just in this period alone. Most disappeared in the Amazon, but a few may have gone down in the same or a similar region to Hotel Kilo. A Beechcraft Baron took off from Rio Santos Airport at 4:47 a.m. on July 14, 1967. The aircraft had only 2 pilots on board and was destined for Salvador and the state of Bahia. The aircraft was expected to check in with controllers at Vitória, Caravelas, and Ilhus before reaching Salvador. Last contact occurred over Vitória at 6:33 a.m. when the pilot made his scheduled check-in. Nothing more was heard. Searches were conducted across the 311-kilometer area between Vitória and Caravelas. No trace of the aircraft was ever found. December 11, 1968, an unknown Cessna departed Sao Paulo's Campo de Marte Airport for Curitiba. The aircraft and its 3 occupants would not arrive. Searches would start soon afterwards, but would fail to locate the aircraft. The mountain terrain the aircraft would have been flying over is almost entirely covered in dense jungles. On January 28, 1969, a Grumman S-2 anti-submarine warfare aircraft belonging to the Brazilian Air Force departed Santa Cruz Air Base with 2 crew on board. A few minutes after departure, the crew sent a brief message saying that they were about to make a forced landing. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately. The crew did not give a location, but it was believed that the plane crashed in the sea a few kilometers off Ilha Grande. an island located within 20 kilometers of Ponta Grossa de Miramaya and Angra dos Reis. Despite having survival equipment on board and immediate searches by air and sea, no trace of the aircraft or its occupants were found. On January 25, 1972, a Cessna 172 with 4 on board departed Sao Paulo for a trip to Ubatuba and Praia Grande before returning to Sao Paulo. The aircraft had departed sometime in the morning and had made it to Ubatuba and Praia Grande without apparent incident. The aircraft had departed sometime in the morning and had made it to Ubatuba and Praia Grande without apparent incident. They departed from there at 4:40 p.m. for the short 55-kilometer flight back to Sao Paulo. Weather was poor with fog being present. The following day, it was realized that the aircraft had not arrived back at Sao Paulo or any possible alternate airports in the area. Search was initiated on the 27th, starting with 2 helicopters, later increasing to a total of 15 aircraft, covering a total area of 13,500 square kilometers over 2 weeks. It was believed to have crashed somewhere in the Serra do Mar with a search area of 2,250 square kilometers. A hunter would report hearing an explosion and bright flash from his cabin near the Serra Mineira on the day of the accident. Searches would be called off 2 weeks later after finding nothing. This aircraft was eventually found somewhere in the Serra do Mar in June of 1984. I was unable to find out where it was actually located. On August 19, 1976, a Sikorsky SH-3 anti-submarine warfare helicopter took off from the Brazilian aircraft carrier Minas Gerais. It was performing a nighttime exercise off the coast of Rio de Janeiro with 4 crew on board. Contact was lost while the helicopter was off Cabo Frio. Searches for the helicopter were still underway in early October of 1976. Its wreckage was not found until June of 1994. Lastly, on August 14, 1978, a Cessna 206 would go missing between Goiânia and Rio de Janeiro with 2 on board. It's unclear where exactly the aircraft was believed to have gone dead. Clear that the regions of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo are a hotbed for aviation disappearances. None of these seem to match particularly well with Hotel Kilo, though. Hotel Kilo was the only one of these aircraft to go down in the month of May. Of the 15 missing aircraft in the area, 6 went down in January, 3 went down in August, 2 went down in July, and 1 each in November and December. The time of year in which Papa Tango, India November Yankee went down is known. Another difference is the weather, which was good enough to enable Hotel Kilo to fly under VFR on May 13th, while most of the incidents that received meaningful coverage had occurred during poor weather conditions. In addition to looking at missing aircraft, I also looked at accidents involving the BN-2 in Brazil as well as accidents involving VOTEC. There were 3 other accidents involving VOTEC Islanders in 1979, 1980, and 1987, but these accidents don't have enough information to fully explore. Looking at other accidents involving the Islander does produce a few interesting results. On May 12, 1977, a BN-2 Islander was performing a survey flight near Curitiba under VFR. Visibility was good, but there were broken clouds at around 3,000 feet. After a routine communication near Paranagua, the aircraft would not be heard from again. Its wreck was found by searchers on a mountain at 3,000 feet. It was believed that the lone pilot had failed to maintain visual contact with the mountains, resulting in a controlled flight into terrain. On August 10, 1978, an Islander was performing a survey flight near Pedro de Toledo in the state of Sao Paulo when it abruptly went out of control and crashed. 2 of the 3 occupants were killed. August 11, 1980, a few months after the disappearance of Hotel Kilo, another Islander would depart Santos Dumont. This aircraft was modified for aerial photography work. A single pilot and 2 technicians were on board the aircraft to test newly installed survey equipment. 3 minutes after takeoff, the pilot announced his intention to return due to some sort of problem. While attempting to return, the plane would crash into a field. The pilot and one of the technicians were killed, while the second technician would later die in hospital. It's not stated what caused the crash, but seeing as though the aircraft was 3 minutes away from an airport, it must have been serious to cause it to crash in such a short period of time. We concede that accidents befalling Brazilian survey aircraft are not unheard of. These accidents show that aircraft can suddenly crash with little to no warning. Of particular interest is the 1977 accident. This aircraft was flying in a mountainous area under VFR. Weather was good except for a broken cloud layer at 3,000 feet, which was also the approximate height of the mountains in the area. This appears to have caused a controlled flight into terrain. On May 13th, there may have been clouds present in the region Hotel Kilo was flying. Of course, when looking at accidents involving islanders going missing in mountainous jungle terrain, the 2014 disappearance of 8 Romeo Golf Hotel Echo in Guyana should also be mentioned. I've already discussed this incident in a previous video. This aircraft went missing during a short cargo flight in Guyana's interior regions. The disappearance of Hotel Echo shows how easy it is for an aircraft to go missing in the jungle. This aircraft was fitted with advanced tracking equipment to help locate the aircraft in such an event, and searches were started as quickly as possible. Despite this, and a relatively small search area, no trace of the aircraft was found. Given this, it's no wonder why Hotel Kilo was not found. It had taken around a week for anyone to raise the alarm about Hotel Kilo's disappearance. The area it was expected to cover was vast, and the route was unknown and subject to significant variance while in flight. It wasn't even clear where they were supposed to land. These reasons are, in all likelihood, why Hotel Kilo was never found. The time taken to inform rescuers of a missing aircraft can have a major impact on the success of the subsequent search. One real-life example of this comes from Larry Kush's Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. He discusses a series of incidents which occurred in January of 1967, referred to as the Black Week. On January 11, 1967, a Chase Ava truck departed Fort Lauderdale at 9:25 a.m. for the island of Bimini, carrying movie equipment for a film being shot on the island. It would fail to arrive, presumably crashing en route, killing all 4 on board. Next, just 3 days later, on January 14th, a Beechcraft J-35 Bonanza took off from Key Largo, possibly bound for Marathon. A couple fishing near Key Largo would report seeing an aircraft leaving the airport, then emitting some sort of sputtering sound as it headed out towards the sea. It would also go missing, presumably killing all 4 on board. Black Week would come to an end on January 17th, when a Piper Apache carrying 3 people went missing between San Juan, Puerto Rico, and St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Weather was reportedly poor at the time. Of primary interest in these cases are when the aircraft were declared missing, when the search started, and what the result of the search was. The U.S. Coast Guard started searching for the Ava truck within 15 minutes of the aircraft's expected arrival time at Bimini. In the case of the Bonanza, it was 12 hours until someone reported it missing around midnight, meaning searches couldn't start until sunrise. For the Apache, it took 9 hours. Searchers failed to locate any trace of the Bonanza or Apache, but a debris patch from the Ava truck was found within an hour of the search beginning. A Coast Guard helicopter retrieved a number of items from the field, consisting of items such as a part of the landing gear and a film canister. The reason why the search for the Ava truck was far more successful than the other 2 has a simple explanation. Of these 3 aircraft, only the Ava truck's crew had filed a flight plan. This meant that the authorities immediately knew something was wrong when the plane failed to show up at its planned time and initiated the search. The other aircraft were not reported missing for hours, allowing ample time for debris to sink or be moved away from the crash site by currents. A similar situation occurred with Hotel Kilo. The aircraft doesn't appear to have filed a flight plan, likely due to the nature of its survey work. Worse, VOTEC does not appear to have made any arrangements to confirm Hotel Kilo had arrived at any of its overnight stops. Thus, they only reported the aircraft missing after about a week had passed. The searches for the Bonanza and the Apache were hindered by a delay measured in hours. The consequences of delaying a search for days would be much greater. Even on land, where ocean currents wouldn't affect the wreckage, fires or smoke that could assist searchers would likely burn out within a week. And let's not forget the obvious effect this delay would have for any survivors, assuming there were. Without any food, no mention of any survival equipment, temperatures approaching 0 degrees Celsius at night, and other perils of the jungle, as well as likely injuries, the chances of survival for a week are not high. To better understand the possible route Hotel Kilo may have flown on its final flight, I decided to fly them in a flight simulator, specifically X-Plane 11 using the Nimbus BN2B Islander. I flew each of the 4 routes proposed in the coverage of the disappearance. Due to the lack of a final report, a lot of assumptions need to be made. Exact weather was not provided, so I set the weather to have good but not perfect visibility and a few clouds. This would be ideal for VFR flight. The aircraft was filled with a full fuel load of 138 gallons or 842 pounds. Given the possible length of the flight and the range of the Islander, this seems to be a reasonable assumption. A total of 7 occupants were added to the aircraft, plus 80 pounds of cargo. This would represent any personal belongings or equipment brought along by the occupants for work. Each flight departed Santos Dumont Airport at 12:30 p.m. All flights would be performed at 7,000 feet. The aircraft had no pressurization system and thus could not fly above 10,000 feet. 7,000 feet is an adequate height for avoiding terrain in the area, with a few exceptions. After takeoff from Santos Dumont, we head west towards Marambaya. We will fly close to the famous Cristo Redentor statue in the Tijuca National Park. By Jacarapagua, we should have reached 7,000 feet. Even with a more gradual climb, the aircraft would be able to reach any altitude it was likely to fly at well before reaching Marambaya. Multiple small airports exist near here if the aircraft needed to make an emergency landing. As we depart the urban area surrounding Rio, we would approach Marambaya. At this point, we are near the Santa Cruz Air Base and a small, dilapidated runway on the Restinga de Marambaya. At this point, a possible explanation for why the aircraft needed the assistance of the Varig Electra to contact ATC becomes apparent. The mountains of the Tijuca National Park are between Santos Dumont and Marambaya. These mountains might inhibit communications with an aircraft flying below 10,000 feet west of the airport. In contrast, an airliner flying at a higher altitude may not be affected and thus could serve as a bridge for Hotel Kilo. This has implications for the rest of the flight, as the inability to communicate with the ground may not have been constant. In all of my tests, leaving at 12:30, I arrived at Marambaya around 12:51. After reaching Ponta Grossa de Marambaya, the aircraft would have to cross over the sea for about 14 kilometers to reach Angra. A direct flight path to Angra from Marambaya takes about 8 to 10 minutes at 120 knots. There are 2 airports in or around Angra and 2 more near Mangaratiba. These areas also have large patches of flat farmland. The area is highly developed, dotted with numerous coastal towns and villages. Inland is another story, with the mountains and dense jungles showing little human activity beyond a few villages and ruins. This pattern continues until the aircraft reaches Parati. From 7,000 feet, the Paraiba Valley is clearly visible to the north. As we approach Parati, it's clear that we will fly near or over this town to reach Praia do Sono while flying over land. The lack of any witness reports from this town are thus interesting. Parati is also home to a small airport. After passing Praia do Sono and crossing over the border from the state of Rio de Janeiro to the state of Sao Paulo, the terrain becomes much rougher. Mountainous terrain covers most of the territory between here and Caraguatatuba. The one exception is the town of Ubatuba, located a few kilometers west of Rio Itamambuta. Possibly this is the river referred to as Rio Itambira in the newspaper. Ubatuba is home to an airport equipped with an NDB. While flying near here and looking north, we can still see the Paraiba Valley in the distance. A possible airstrip is located near Praia Dura, though this may simply be a strip of cleared land. Caraguatatuba does not have an airport, but large patches of clear land near the town might be adequate for an emergency landing. North of Caraguatatuba is the massive Represa de Paraibuna. In order to reach Ponta do Boi on Ilha Bela, the aircraft must fly over the sea for a second time over the São Sebastião Channel, between the towns of São Sebastião on the mainland and Ilha Bela on the island of the same name. After reaching Ponta do Boi, we will pass over this same channel to return to the mainland. These are short distances, however, with the width only being around 2 kilometers. Both towns appear to be fairly large, with São Sebastião currently being home to an oil terminal and port. Again, the lack of witnesses from these two towns that Hotel Kilo would have needed to pass over is interesting. Ilha Bela once had a small airport, but it has since been closed and converted into a park. I could not find out when this had occurred. Another long stretch of mountainous terrain without any airports exists between here and the city of Sao Paulo. The only airport to be found along the stretch is a small one located in Biritiba Marim, a town located well inland that is surrounded by small reservoirs. Papa Tango November Bravo Delta went down near here in 1978. Its wreck wasn't found for months despite being a couple of kilometers from a village. Eventually, the aircraft reaches the area between Santos and Sao Paulo, covered in dense jungle and reservoir. Given the lack of witness reports or contact from the aircraft, it seems unlikely that Hotel Kilo ever made it to this point, let alone beyond it if it had taken this route at all. The aircraft was to continue along the coastal mountains before heading back east to Viracopos. Upon landing at Viracopos, I had been in the air for slightly less than 4 hours, arriving at 4:19 p.m. I still had 50 gallons or 308 pounds of fuel on board. Based on the other flights, I don't think I did the best job of conserving fuel on this flight. I would improve this on later tests. At no point during this flight, while flying at 7,000 feet, did I encounter any terrain high enough to pose a risk of causing a controlled flight into terrain. Route 2 is similar to Route 1 until reaching Paraty. Instead of heading west into the state of Sao Paulo, the aircraft would stay in the state of Rio de Janeiro and head back towards Angra. It is not stated which route would be taken. If the crew opted to take the shortest possible route, they would have flown over the sea towards Angra for about 50 kilometers. Alternatively, they could have backtracked via the Serra de Bopaina. I took the shortcut for this flight. After Angra, the aircraft would fly east over the Serra das Araras towards Itacaruca. It would pass near the airports in Angra and Mangaratiba, as well as a small strip located in the Serra das Araras. While flying through this region, it would fly near the Represa do Ribeirão das Lajes. This is a massive reservoir surrounded in jungle. After Itacaruca, the aircraft approaches the dense urban area of Rio. I landed the aircraft at 2:17 p.m. after less than 2 hours in the air. 104 gallons or 636 pounds of fuel are left on board. Route 3 also follows a similar path to Paraty. At Paraty, the aircraft turns around and heads north towards Itatiaia in the Paraíba Valley. This would result in the aircraft flying over 80 kilometers, 60 of which would be over dense jungle-covered mountains. There are no airports in this area. The Fanil hydroelectric plant and its reservoir is a landmark along this route. After reaching Itatiaia, the aircraft would fly north to the mountains rising over the town. Unlike the coastal routes, this route cannot be safely flown at 7,000 feet. Much of the terrain in this area rises up to or exceeds 7,000 feet, with some points reaching as high as 9,000 feet. As the aircraft couldn't have gone higher than 10,000 feet, this produces a rather tight space for the aircraft to fly through. By flying at 9,000 feet, I was able to fly near these mountains. Continuing along the Mantiqueira Mountains, we pass multiple airports in the Paraíba Valley, some of which are developed enough to have their own navigation aids. The terrain of the Paraíba Valley itself is quite hilly, but covered in farms and towns. After flying west over the Mantiqueira Mountains for a while, we approach Pico da Gomera. At this point, the mountains are low enough that returning to 7,000 feet is possible. As we approach Sao Paulo, we fly near 3 reservoirs northwest of São José dos Campos. Upon nearing the municipality of Mauá, part of the greater Sao Paulo area, the aircraft heads east back towards Itatiaia. This time the crew may have flown slightly to the south of the populated parts of the Paraíba Valley, though I can only guess. Given the nature of the flight, flying over the same terrain seems counterproductive. If the aircraft took this route, it would have flown near to the Paraibuna region, where the mysterious explosion was heard days before the plane was reported missing. The Paraibuna region is also home to the Paraibuna Reservoir. The flight to Itataya would be over or near hilly terrain with only small patches of jungle and numerous villages and farms. After passing Itataya, the aircraft would fly towards Itaguai. This route would take the aircraft near or over the Serra das Araras and the Represa do Ribeirão das Lajes. This part of the route may have passed near that taken by Armindo Brochado during his final flight to Rio in 1969. The remains of Brochado went to Cessna near Itaguai would not be found for 9 years. After reaching Itaguai, the aircraft enters the Rio area. When I returned to Rio Santos at 4:26 p.m., the aircraft still had 64 gallons or 390 pounds of fuel remaining. The fourth route was proposed by UFF and University of Sao Paulo geologists on June 13. Though not stated, it appears as though this route was based on the investigations performed by the two geographers in May. This route is identical to the others until reaching Angra. At Angra, the plane flies west over the Serra da Bocaina National Park and towards Cunha. At Cunha, the aircraft turns towards Itataya, passing within sight of Campos de Cunha. The Cunha area is hilly and has no airport, but is home to a large number of farms and has a few small patches of jungle. Besides a few small rivers and creeks, no notable bodies of water exist here. At some point, the aircraft stopped flying towards Itataya, instead heading north towards Cruzeiro. The terrain along the route to Cruzeiro is similar to that around Cunha. The plane then flew near or over Cruzeiro and towards the Pico da Gomera. I arrived at the Pico da Gomera at 1:41 p.m. with 112 gallons or 688 pounds of fuel remaining. No more information regarding this route is provided. This may be because those proposing the route had a theory they were basing it off. It follows the known route of the aircraft to Marambaya and its next planned location in Angra. From here, the staff at the universities appear to have been basing everything off the reports of the two geographers. The path over the Serra da Bocaina is the shortest route to Cunha, where stories of an aircraft in distress were told to the geographers. The aircraft in this theory presumably traveled towards Campos de Cunha while traveling towards Itataya. At this point, the sighting made by the woodsman near Cruzeiro was incorporated into the theory. They now claim that the aircraft would fly towards Cruzeiro, where it would be seen by the woodsman and heard crashing near the Pico de Gomera. This theory will be explored further in the next part of the video. The most interesting bit of information gained from these tests is a possible explanation for the inability to contact Santos Dumont. The mountains west of the airport could have obstructed the radio contact coming from Hotel Kilo at an altitude lower than 10,000 feet. In contrast, an aircraft like the Lockheed Electra could climb well above 10,000 feet and could get high enough to not be affected by the mountains. Thus, they could communicate with both Hotel Kilo and Santos Dumont and serve as a bridge. This explains the inability to directly contact Santos Dumont from Marambaya, not the lack of any other communications. Mountainous terrain along the coast may have further inhibited communication, but the region between two of Brazil's largest cities was likely a very busy airspace. It seems unlikely that no other aircraft would be available to serve as a bridge or hear a distress call along the route. This becomes even less of an issue on any routes traveling inland, as the terrain would allow for easier direct contact with ground controllers. These tests also seem to disprove any possibility of the aircraft getting lost. Numerous VORs and NDBs are located along every route. An even greater number of airports are available. If the crew had somehow gotten lost, the rugged islander would have been able to land at any of these, no matter how small or rough. The terrain is also quite distinctive. For much of the flight, looking to the left would reveal the Atlantic Ocean, while looking to the right would reveal the Paraíba Valley. Of course, we should also remember that both pilots were highly experienced and were carrying a team of experienced geographers who would have needed to have a decent level of familiarity with the area to carry out their work. They likely had highly detailed maps and SLAR mosaics to reference. If any group of people could avoid getting lost in this region, it was this one. This information combines to point towards some sort of sudden accident. If there was some sort of slowly unfolding crisis, the crew would have had time to make a distress call and attempt to reach one of the many suitable landing areas in the region. While some scenario where the aircraft stayed in the air for an extended period of time without being able to reach an airport or make a distress call could be theorized, the simplest explanation is that the aircraft crashed suddenly with little chance to do either. As much of the area is too clear or populated to conceal the aircraft, this should help limit the area in which the crash could have occurred. I don't have enough information to look at any particular theories as to why Hotel Kilo crashed. I do think there is enough information to try and examine where it might have crashed, though. I divided the region in which Hotel Kilo may have been flying into 20 different areas. These areas include all places where searches were performed or witness reports were made. When examining these areas, a few things should be kept in mind. While the routes shown depict the aircraft flying directly between each point, it's likely that Hotel Kilo would divert from these routes to some extent. On May 27th, the Jornal de Brazil would describe the route the aircraft would take as moving, quote, in a kind of zigzag pattern but never straying too far out towards the sea, end quote, when flying between Marambaya and Angra. It is likely that this would have been the case for the rest of the flight as well. Given that the purpose of the flight was to compare terrain to that depicted on previous SLAR mosaics, it's likely that the aircraft would divert from its path at points to closely examine neighboring terrain. Thus, just because no routes take the aircraft through an area, this doesn't rule out the possibility of the aircraft entering that area, though it does make it less likely. Hotel Kilo's final communication occurred as it was flying near the Ponta Grossa de Marambaya 26 minutes after takeoff. The crew had stated their intentions to fly under VFR until reaching Angra. This implies that the crew would leave VFR upon reaching there, necessitating a call to ATC to cancel VFR. The most likely reason that this call was not made would have been due to the plane crashing, but reasonable alternative explanations, such as an inability to reach ATC or a change in plans, means that a crash after this point is still possible, but nevertheless, a crash beyond this point is less likely than one before. This reports will factor into this analysis, but will be taken with an appropriate level of skepticism. It should be remembered that none of these reports were helpful enough to lead searchers to the wreck of Hotel Kilo. Many were of dubious value, clearly contradicting available evidence such as the date of the accident or even being proven wrong by searchers. Nearly all of the reports were made after the news started reporting on the disappearance. Likewise, while the lack of witness reports in an area makes it less likely for the aircraft to be there, the possibility cannot be ruled out. Many of these areas are so remote that there may be few witnesses to see or hear a crash. In others, dense jungles may prevent anyone in urban areas from seeing or hearing a distant plane crash. Ultimately, we are looking for areas in which an aircraft's wreck could not just remain hidden from searchers in the weeks following the crash, but from anyone else for another 45 years. The only three ways that this could happen in this region is if the aircraft went down in the sea, an isolated area of jungle, or an inland body of water, such as a lake or reservoir. Given the nature of the flight and various statements made in the papers, it's unlikely that the aircraft crashed in the sea, with the exception of a few areas in which it may have needed to cross it. This means that inland bodies of water and areas with large, dense jungles with little sign of human habitation are of particular interest. Every area will be examined in detail and given a likelihood of being the final resting place of Hotel Kilo. These will be indicated by a color and a title as indicated here. We will start with the areas in the very unlikely category. This includes Area 1, Area 12, Area 13, Area 16, and Area 20. Area 1 is located to the east of Marambaya. It is home to Rio de Janeiro and other smaller urban areas. There are a few places in this area in which an aircraft wreck could be concealed for 45 years. The available evidence strongly points to Hotel Kilo leaving this area prior to its disappearance. Apart from one dubious claim from the Placevinte area, On the 25th of May, there were no alleged sightings of the aircraft here. Hotel Kilo likely went down long before returning to this area if it was following routes 2 or 3. Area 12 covers the region around Cunha and Campos de Cunha. The UFF geographers would hear multiple stories of an aircraft in distress while investigating the area in the early days of the search. These reports don't claim that the aircraft went down in this area, merely that it was in distress. This is really the only reason to believe that the aircraft was even in this area. Only Route 3 and 4 would ever have entered this area, and I'm not even entirely sure about the former. The land surrounding Cunha is hilly but occupied by farmland and small villages. Few small forested areas exist, while there are no large bodies of water. Area 13 is home to the Paraiba Valley. This region is the most populated and developed area between Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Multiple cities dot the valley, as well as countless towns and villages. The land not occupied by these towns and cities are filled with farmland. A number of reports were made in this area during the search, but were either disproven or of very dubious quality. 16 is located north of the Mantiqueira mountain range. Multiple dubious reports were made in this area. It suffers from many of the same issues as Area 12 and 13. The area is mostly agricultural, with few patches of jungle or bodies of water. No route was even intended to pass through this area. Lastly, Area 20 is home to the city of Sao Paulo and Viracopos Airport. This area has similar issues to Area 1, being mostly agricultural and well-developed. There was a large patch of jungle to the south, but it's unlikely Hotel Kilo made it this far into the flight without being seen or making any further communications. Only routes 1 and 3 make it into this area, with Route 3 only entering it briefly. No witness reports were made in this area. Moving on to the next category, we will cover the unlikely areas. This consists of Area 5, Area 8, Area 9, Area 15, Area 18, and Area 19. Area 5 covers Isla Grande and its surrounding waters. The island is covered in jungles, but is home to multiple towns, villages, and resorts. Isla Grande is a state park, so the interior of the island is likely crossed by numerous trails and would be well traveled by tourists. Route 2 is the only one that might pass through this area, as the plane returned to Angra. All other routes would pass near the area during the earlier part of the flight. Moving to the waters surrounding the island, these are believed to be the final resting place of the FAB Grumman tracker that disappeared after takeoff from Santa Cruz Air Base in 1969. But beyond this, there is no real evidence suggesting that Hotel Kilo's remains lie in this area. Area 8 is centered around the city of Itatiaia and the Represa do Funil. This massive reservoir is the only real reason to suspect this area as being the final resting place of Hotel Kilo. In terms of geography, Area 8 is very similar to the adjacent Cunha and Paraiba areas. There are few patches of jungle breaking up the vast swaths of busy farmland in the area. Route 3 is the only one to pass through here, but it would do so twice in its flight. No searches were performed here, and the Represa do Funil is the only real reason that I haven't put it in the very unlikely category. Area 9 sits to the north of Area 8. This area covers the Itatiaia National Park, home to some of the highest mountains in the region. These peaks reach above 9,000 feet, though there's little significant vegetation above 7,500 feet. Surprisingly, for such heights, there are roads traveling as high as 800 feet. Numerous buildings and trails dot the area, suggesting that the park is more accessible than it may seem at first glance. The lower parts of the mountain are covered in dense jungles. The only route to enter this area is Route 3. No searches or witness reports were made in this area. Area 15 covers the western part of the Mantiqueira mountain range. In the eastern part of the area, terrain rises above 6,000 feet. To the west, multiple large reservoirs are present. The area is covered in dense jungle, though many towns and roads cut through it. The only route to enter this area is Route 3. Given the distance from Marimbaya and the lack of any sightings in this area, it seems unlikely that Hotel Kilo went down this far from its last known location without any credible sightings. Area 17 consists of Isla Bella and its surrounding waters. Only Route 1 travels through this area. The island is home to multiple coastal towns and villages on its coast, while the interior is much quieter. In order to reach the island, Hotel Kilo would need to fly over the Sao Sebastião Channel. This means that the aircraft would have had to fly over the sea for a brief period, though the channel is quite small and large towns exist on both sides of it. No witness reports were made from this area, as it's quite far away from Marimbaya and no other evidence points to Hotel Kilo ever arriving here. This area does seem unlikely. Area 18 surrounds the Paraibuna Reservoir. This was where the strange reports of an explosion and aircraft in distress were made shortly before Hotel Kilo was reported missing. The aircraft went missing on the 13th, while the reports of an explosion occurred on the 19th. Despite searches being made of the largely agricultural area, no trace of the aircraft was found, despite the fact that a mid-air explosion would spread debris over a wide area. The time of day is also suspect. It was claimed that the explosion occurred around 7:40 p.m. Based on my testing, the islanders should have only been able to stay in the air for about 4.5 hours. Some islanders have additional fuel tanks installed, but it's not known if Hotel Kilo was fitted with these. Even then, after 7 hours in the air, the aircraft would be running out of fuel, assuming it hadn't already, and should have completed its flight or found an alternate airport hours ago. If these reports hadn't been made prior to the aircraft being reported missing, I would be inclined to treat these reports similar to those made in Itamhandu. The most striking feature of this area is the Paraibuna Reservoir. This body of water actually provides a potential alternative explanation for the sound heard on the 19th. Prior to this date, a series of earthquakes had occurred in the area. Geologists had determined that the cause was the settlement of soil around the Paraitinga and Paraibuna reservoirs. It is not inconceivable that some similar event could produce a loud noise that was mistaken for an explosion. In addition to this, the neighboring Kunai area reported that it was relatively common for FAB aircraft to fly over the area and create sonic booms. It is not known if any FAB operations were occurring in this area when this explosion was heard, but it could explain the explosion and sighting of the plane. None of these witnesses appear to have given any description of the aircraft, except for the farmer who claimed to have seen a small twin-engine aircraft explode. Only Route 3 travels through this area. Given all of this, I don't find the sightings around this area compelling. If Hotel Kilo had gone down here, it should have been found. Area 19 is located to the west of Area 18. This covers the region between Sao Paulo and Isla Bella, covered in dense, barely touched mountainous jungle terrain and multiple reservoirs. The area is in complete isolation, a perfect area for an aircraft to go missing. Papa Tango, November Bravo Delta, would do so in 1978, eluding searchers and only being discovered by chance despite being 2.5 kilometers from a village. Deeper in the jungle, a successful search would be nearly impossible. If Hotel Kilo had made it here and crashed, it would be extremely difficult to find it. However, looking at the greater context and other available evidence, the possibility of Hotel Kilo crashing here becomes much less credible. The only routes that traveled through here were routes 1 and 3. To my knowledge, no reports of the aircraft being seen between Marimbaya and Area 19 were made. This area is very far from Marimbaya and Angra, and thus seems quite unlikely to be the final resting place of Hotel Kilo. Moving on to the somewhat unlikely category, this includes Area 7, Area 11, and Area 14. Area 7 is located south of Area 8. This area is covered in jungles, mountains, and hills, but also farmland and various signs of human activity. Much of the land is clear, especially to the north. The only route that passed through here was Route 3. No searches or witness reports occurred here. Despite the lack of evidence, the relatively close proximity to the last known position does add a little more credibility to this area. Area 11 covers the coastal territory between Parati and Isla Bella. The coastal areas are well populated, though less so in the east. Further inland, the Serra do Mar tower over the coastal towns. These mountains are sparsely populated and covered in jungles. There isn't much credible evidence that the aircraft made it this far, but it isn't impossible that it disappeared here due to the terrain. Area 14 is a small region surrounding the Túnel de Mantiqueira, a railway tunnel connecting Cruzeiro to the state of Minas Gerais. The area is surrounded by mountainous jungles with a path between them through which the railway and its tunnel are found. This area is notable as being the endpoint of Route 4. Though not stated, this route appears to have been based on the research and investigations of the UFF and University of Sao Paulo. This route appears to follow a theory based on witness sightings pointing towards a crash site near a peak called the Focinho do Sal. Unhelpfully, there are 3 peaks with this name in the region. I believe that the third one is the most likely, as it is closest to both Cruzeiro and the area searched based on the report made by the woodsman to the geographers there. I don't think this theory is particularly strong. The fact it didn't lead to the discovery of the aircraft doesn't disprove it, as the jungles in the area could easily conceal a route from searchers. The main issue is that it relies on a few dubious eyewitness reports. The witnesses in the Cunha area had correctly given the date of May 13th for their sightings, but no reason was given for why they didn't report it until after the search started. The aircraft they described was clearly in distress, so why they waited to report it is odd. It is also not explained why this supposed aircraft didn't attempt to land at any of the airports or farmland in the area or flew towards Cruzeiro. Despite Cruzeiro being a sizable city and this aircraft being in apparent distress while flying near it, only a single witness report was made from this region. Unless there was some other information being factored into this theory that I don't know about, there doesn't seem to be much reason to believe Hotel Kilo crashed here. That being said, the fact that this is the only part of the Mantiqueira Mountains to have any sort of witness reports made, as well as the fact that this area is covered in very dense jungle, does make it more likely than areas 9 and 15. The somewhat likely category consists of Area 3, Area 6, and Area 10. Area 3 covers the Serra das Araras. This area is adjacent to both Marambaia and Angra. While only routes 2 and 3 pass through this area, the aircraft may have visited here while flying between Marambaia and Angra. Hotel Kilo was supposedly zigzagging, and this pattern may have taken it into the Serra das Araras. While the northern part of the area is mostly inhabited and bare, the south is home to jungles and mountains. One of these mountains was likely the final resting place of Armindo Brochado and his Cesta, which crashed there in 1969. He wouldn't be found for another 9 years. If Hotel Kilo crashed deep in the jungles of the area, it could be next to impossible to locate. The radio call claiming to be from the aircraft was made from somewhere called Araras, and of the 2 locations that this could have been, this seems to be the most likely one. This may not mean much, as these calls do seem rather dubious, only being made after the disappearance was reported in the media. No witness reports were made in the area, including the coastal towns to the south and the Represa do Ribeirão das Lajes, a reservoir in a secluded eastern part of the area. Area 6 covers the southern coastal part of the Serra da Bocaina, just to the west of Angra. All 4 routes would take Hotel Kilo through the area after passing Angra. In addition to this, Route 2 may have passed through here twice in order to return to Angra after surveying the Purate area. The coastal part of the area is quite busy, home to many small towns and villages, but this quickly changes as we move north. Few traces of civilization can be seen in the northern part of the area, as the coastal resorts and beaches make way for thick jungles, short but steep mountains, and a few small rivers and paths. No witness reports were made from this area, though given its size and isolation, this hardly disqualifies it from being the final resting place of Hotel Kilo. The only issue I see that keeps this area from being in the likely category is the lack of contact at Angra. Lastly, Area 10 is home to Parati and its surrounding areas. The whole area is mountainous and covered in jungles, but the area to the north is of particular interest. The mountains here rise above 5,500 feet, with eastern faces that are better described as cliffs. Like the southern Serra de Bocaina area, the coastal areas are quite busy, while the inland areas are largely uninhabited. Routes 1, 2, and 3 pass through this area. The lack of contact at Angra remains an issue, though this is all that's keeping the area from being a credible final resting place for Hotel Kilo. The final two areas fall under the likely category. These are the areas in which I think the remains of Hotel Kilo and its 7 occupants are most likely to be found. Area 2 covers the stretch of water just north of Marambaya, while Area 4 covers Angra and its surroundings. All 4 routes would pass through these areas. The last contact with Hotel Kilo occurred near Marambaya. The pilot said they would continue to Angra under VFR. This implies that they would leave VFR, which would require them to communicate with ATC. No message of this kind was received, despite the busy airspace between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro undoubtedly being occupied by multiple aircraft which could have received such a message and passed it on to ATC. No witness reports originated from Angra or the neighboring towns, despite all being of considerable size and presumably being near or on the flight path of Hotel Kilo. The simplest explanation for all of this is that the aircraft never made it to Angra. While searchers were initially confident that Hotel Kilo could not have gone down at sea due to its survey mission keeping it away from the water, they seem to have grown less sure of this assumption. While the belief that the aircraft stayed away from the water for most of the flight does seem to have been well-founded, the Marambaya area was a clear exception to this conclusion. At the very end of the search efforts, underwater searches in the Marambaya area would be conducted. Given the small size of this search and the relatively large size of the search area, this seems inadequate to conclusively prove that Hotel Kilo was not in this area. Though it's within view of multiple towns and appears to be frequently crossed by ship traffic, there are potential explanations for this. The size of this body of water is such that a small aircraft going down further away from shore may have been difficult to see or hear, especially from the shore. The week-long delay would have let floating debris scatter far from a crash site in this area. Ships traveling through the area during this week would not have known that an aircraft was missing and may not have paid any attention to debris in the water, perhaps dismissing it as simple garbage, assuming it was seen at all. As for Area 4, the western section is home to a few small towns and cities, notably Angra dos Reis. It's doubtful that Hotel Kilo went down in this part of the area, or the agricultural fields to the north. Of more interest is the eastern part of the area, where few traces of civilization can be seen. These jungles and mountains appear to be no different than those in other areas, but are the only ones to lie directly on the shortest possible flight path between Marambaya and Angra. These jungles are likely hard to search, but despite the compelling evidence for this area being the final resting place of Hotel Kilo, searchers appear to have shown little interest in the area. The VOTEC helicopter fitted with metal detecting equipment was based in Angra towards the end of search efforts, but it isn't clear if it was searching this area as well. All 4 routes travel through this area, with Route 2 passing through here twice. Given the last known position of Hotel Kilo, its planned flight paths, and lack of compelling evidence coming from anywhere else in the region, I consider areas 2 and 4 as being the most likely resting place of Hotel Kilo. The story of Hotel Kilo would be quickly forgotten in Brazil and completely unknown internationally. Various international events, such as the lead-up to the elections in the United States, Canada, and Japan, and the related turmoil surrounding them, as well as the greater and more noteworthy catastrophes in Washington, Nebraska, Florida, Jamaica, and South Korea, pushed a minor story about a small plane with only 7 people on board out of the public interest. VOTEC would survive the poor publicity of the disappearance. In June, 2 of their Sikorsky S-61 helicopters would be modified to serve Pope John Paul II during his visit to Brazil. On August 8, 1980, VOTEC would go public, launching with over 266 million shares. Later that month, the company would announce a 329% increase in net profits. These good times would not last. The company would reach its peak in 1982. The ongoing economic decline of Brazil would begin to hit VOTEC. It would also have difficulty with its lucrative contracts supplying offshore oil rigs. Making a bad situation worse were a pair of fatal accidents involving VOTEC's banderantes. On February 24, 1981, a banderante carrying 14 people was attempting to land at Belém in poor weather. Pilots flew too low, colliding with the mast of a ship sitting in dry dock, then crashing into a tug and a pair of barges. Only 3 passengers survived. Worse still, on April 18, 1984, a pair of VOTEC banderantes would be involved in a mid-air collision while trying to land at Imperatriz. One would crash into a river, killing all 18 people on board, while the other would make a crash landing in a field, killing 1 passenger. By March 1985, the airline had 14 fixed-wing aircraft and 29 helicopters as compared to 22 and 35 respectively back in August of 1980. It would be acquired by TAM, a larger Brazilian airline, in July of 1986. As for Project Radam, it was likely rendered obsolete by the advent of satellite imagery. One thought kept nagging me throughout this entire project. I kept wondering whether or not Hotel Kilo and its occupants had been found in the years following their disappearance. They certainly weren't found during the search, but what about the 45 years afterwards? All the sources I could find on the internet as of March 26, 2025 claim that the aircraft is still missing, yet with the language barrier and lack of information, I can't be sure. This certainly exemplifies much of this case. Without a final report or any other kind of report, it's hard to say for certain what happened in the days surrounding this mystery. While I do think that the area between Marambaia and Angra is the most likely resting place with the available information, I can't be entirely certain or confident without more detailed information coming from proper reports instead of newspapers. Until that information is found, we can only hope that Hotel Kilo and its occupants will one day be found, as well as what caused it to crash on May 13th of 1980.